I considered titling this video "Will Self is a Sanctimonious Blowhard," but I'm not sure if I'm brave enough to do that. Hi, I'm Kat and welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, welcome. This is a channel where I like to talk about books and ideas, and today I'm going to be talking to you about a book that I've read recently. This one right here. Have you ever wondered if the whole discourse about how TikTok ruined books is actually new, but really the translation of that is young people ruined this thing I liked? We're about to talk about that. Before we get started, I just wanted to say that after editing this video, I realized that I might be coming off a bit snippy about literary fiction. I want to make it clear that I don't have a problem with litfic as a genre or the people who read it, but rather the smug attitude that the author took in these essays regarding his thoughts on literature. So this book is a collection of essays written by Will Self that have been published in various publications over a 20-year period from 2001 to 2021, and they mostly revolve around reading and books and literary figures as well. I will be honest, I did not read every single word of every single essay in this collection. There are some of them that just weren't really interesting to me. I either didn't understand enough of the material that he was referencing or wasn't interested enough in the figures to really care about what he had to say or what he was writing about. But there are a few essays in here on reading in general and books and like the publishing industry and stuff like that. And so that's what I would like to talk to you about today, and some of Will Self's commentary on today's literary preferences. So for this video, I'm going to talk to you about some of the essays in here that I did read, as well as what I think his messages were, which I'm not actually quite sure on, and we'll get into how he writes and how it's really effing confusing to read. But I want to talk about like what he's saying, what I agree with, where I disagree with him, and just my general thoughts on mostly his delivery of his messages, specifically in his essays about reading. So let's get into that now. So from what I could kind of distill from the various essays on reading and books in here, there are about 3 main messages that he's trying to get across throughout all of these. So the first thing he's talking about is why you should read, why anyone should read. And in the interest of letting him convey his own message in his own words, we will start with a quote from him. So this is from near the end of the Why Read essay, and he says, "Read, because short of meeting and communing with them, and perhaps because of this writing about them, reading about diverse modes of being and consciousness is the best way we have of entering into them and abiding." So interpretation, reading allows you to walk a mile in someone else's shoes. And he spent 10 pages of an 11-page essay getting to a point that I summed up in 11 words. Now, I understand the entire world should not be condensed down into the CliffsNotes version of what anyone is saying. That is kind of the antithesis of really getting into analytical thinking and critical thinking and all that kind of stuff. But Will Self has a very, I don't know if distinct is the word, I think it's just like complex way of writing. He tends to perhaps not over-explain himself, but he uses a lot of big words and complex sentence structure, and I'm not really sure why, other than to frustrate people and to seem superior. But let's expand on what he's saying. Literature and writing in general allows us to access the experience of all kinds of different people, but especially today with the internet and near universal literacy in the developed world, it's cheap and easy and a really good way for people to get their points across. This can be both good and bad. It's good because it allows a diverse range of people to share their thoughts and perspectives, but it's bad because genuinely worthwhile thoughts and perspectives and voices that we should be listening to can be drowned in a sea of frivolous tripe and venomous diatribes. And so I think I broadly agree with what he's saying, that you should read because it allows you to access other people's experiences, and whether that's just stuff people write on the internet or full-on books that they write, it allows you to see through someone else's eyes. And that's a really powerful thing about literature in general and writing, is that cheap and easy communication. All you need is some words and you can communicate a story or perspective or whatever. However, it was evident after reading some of his other essays that Will Self seems to have a very narrow genre that he thinks is worth reading, and everything else is just garbage. And a lot of the words in his various essays about reading seem to be devoted to lamenting the decline of the kind of reading and the kind of literature that he thinks is worthwhile, and that is specifically literary fiction. So this brings us to his next point, which is you are what you read. If we dismiss once and for all the absurd notion that the difficulty or simplicity of a given literary text represents an axis parallel to which, supposedly, runs from dead white man to the contemporary and woke, a supposition that's insulting to all parties concerned, then we can liberate ourselves from the spurious notion that what we read will somehow, in Kafka's rather mocking formulation, constitute the decisive moment in human history. Just as, if we acknowledge the truth that what people actually read in practice are little gobbets of text pinging about in cyberspace, the lexical equivalents to subatomic particles with only limited existence, then we can stop believing that genre fiction, for example, is some kind of guilty pleasure. So I think the interpretation of this quote is old white guys aren't exclusively hard to read, and contemporary literature is not exclusively easy to read, and we need to stop thinking about those two things in that way. Additionally, what he is saying is what you read won't change the world, but I think the subtext of what he is saying in the latter half of that quote, specifically about genre fiction, is that it's not a guilty pleasure if it's all you read. And the subtext of that, or informed by everything else he says in the rest of his essays, is that if you only read genre fiction, then you're not a very well-rounded person. Now, I'm going to be honest. I'm not sure if I'm actually interpreting him correctly, because as you probably have seen from the quotes that we've had so far, he writes in a way that is not exactly straightforward and is really annoying to kind of suss out. And I don't know, maybe you are looking at these quotes going, yep, I understand exactly what he's saying. It's all fine. I have basic English comprehension skills, which is great for you, but I still have trouble understanding what the fuck he's talking about. But he has a disdain for genre fiction throughout all of these essays that borders on derangement. And this made me wonder if he was actually rage baiting me and hiding behind the technical meaning of his words in order to disguise the sneering accusations he was leveling against anyone who didn't like reading the kind of books that he considered proper literature. And I voiced this to my husband, and he immediately pulled up a clip of Will Self on a British news show where he said something that was clearly meant to be contrarian, but it wasn't exactly worded as an insult, but it was meant to be insulting. And I was just like, okay, yep, this is just what he does. And I realized I have not actually talked about who Will Self is. I think he's an author. He's a literary kind of guy, critic dude. He also, I think, teaches English or creative writing or something like that at a university in London. So he's like one of those literary boomer dudes who thinks that the kids are ruining everything. So another quote to kind of make you understand what I am saying. All of which is a way of saying, read what the hell you like. In a literary culture in which a Booker Prize winner, Bernardine Evaristo, can give an interview to the Guardian newspaper in which she states that life is too short for her to read Ulysses, clearly the old idols have fallen. But then, they haven't been the old idols for very long. No, read what you want, but be conscious that, in this area of life, as so many others, you are what you eat. And if your diet is solely pulp, you'll likely become rather pulpy. So clever. Basically what he's saying is that if you don't read things that are deep and meaningful in my view, then you can't possibly be a well-rounded person. And this is my main problem with Will Self. He is not lamenting the decline of books and literature in general. He's lamenting what he perceives as the decline of a certain kind of book and the power of authors and literary fiction writers in the kind of zeitgeist and culture that we have now. And so while I agree that reading is a really good way and probably one of the best ways to learn about other people and learn to empathize with them and learn what their lives are like and things like that, it's not the only way. And to assume that because people read a certain genre of fiction and because that's maybe the only thing that they read or the only thing that they talk about, that they have no other life experience that might expose them to other people, that might give them other perspectives, and that might round them out as human beings.
I also want to be clear that I disagree with his take that literary fiction is the only way for people to gain perspective on the lives of others through reading. Yes, most genre fiction is written specifically as entertainment, but that doesn't mean that it has no artistic value or can't make commentary on society.
But the thing here that's annoying for me is that he's taking this perspective of you are what you read. And the thing is, as much as I hate to admit it, there's other things in the world besides books, and people can have lives outside of books, and there are other things in your life that influence who you are as a person and your perspective on the world, and it doesn't have to just come from books. And there are many reasons that some people might confine themselves when they're reading to a certain kind of fiction, and that's okay. We don't need to be so hung up on what specific people are reading. We need to be more concerned about overall trends that he is talking about, he's right to be concerned about. But it's not about reading, it's about a lot of other much more general amorphous things like political awareness and community involvement and other things in the world. And this made me think about my husband and my father, both of whom are very politically aware. They're engaged in current events. They also have jobs that regularly put them in contact with a lot of other people who are different from them, and those experiences inform their understanding of the world and how they perceive things and think about things. But they both almost exclusively read action, crime, and thriller novels from the likes of John Grisham and Lee Child. And that's okay, because in their limited downtime, they want to engage with something that they're going to find enjoyable rather than bogging themselves down in basically an English lesson. Are there a lot of people who read literary fiction and classics for pleasure? Of course there are, but not everyone is like that, and not everyone needs to be. But what was interesting is that Will Self, when he is talking about examples of the kind of books that he finds, to use his word, pulpy, he often tends to reference books that are written by or for women rather than ones written by or for men. He specifically multiple times references Harry Potter and E.L. James, who wrote 50 Shades of Grey. And it's the kind of thing where I'm just like, dude, the misogyny is like, it's right there. Like, you're not even hiding it. That these are the authors that you pick and that you keep picking on when you are talking about quote unquote serious literature. And I'm not going to defend 50 Shades of Grey. Like, that was smut and it was meant to be smut. I don't think E.L. James was trying to write the next great American novel. But Harry Potter, no matter what you might think of J.K. Rowling, it did have some really interesting political themes and messages and things, especially for a middle grade, young adult, whatever kind of that series was. And so to kind of like poo-poo it and just be like, oh, genre fiction, it's such a classic, I'm an intellectual, I'm above this kind of stuff, and no popular book could ever have a greater message that might be there. Now, I'm not gonna lay this like sexism of the real books and real reading and serious literature kind of argument at Will Self's feet, because we've seen this a lot recently. I'm sure that 20 years before he was writing, there was some guy talking in some newspaper op-ed about how young people today have ruined literature. And recently this has come out in the TikTok ruined books sort of discourse, and there have been 5 million videos on that. And I think this is something that every single generation does with every single bit of media. Music, movies, whatever. Things are always better in my day. And I think that the truth is that it's not that things were like universally better in your day, it's that there were fewer resources in your day, and so there were fewer things that could have been made. Nowadays, I think there's an overabundance of media, and we'll get into, I think, what Will Self is kind of complaining about, which is specifically overproduction. But I think it's also fair to say that we see things from history, and we probably, for the most part, when we're thinking about books and movies and whatever, when we see the ones that have been produced, very long ago, and they are classics, and we look at those and go, things used to be so much better. We were just writing War and Peace all the damn time. But that's not actually what happened. It's just that's the one that survived. And in 100 years, maybe Fourth Wing will be a classic, but maybe no one will remember that it ever existed. So first of all, calm your pants. And second of all, stop being a dick. I also don't know if there's any actual evidence that there has been a decline in either the numbers, the proportion of literary fiction books that are being published. I think that it's really easy, especially in the sort of overproduction of books that we have been seeing, because there's just so much out there, it feels like maybe the kind of gems are drowning in a sea of random crap. And that's a fine criticism to make, but it also doesn't mean that there are no more literary fiction books. It just means there's other stuff out there as well, and that's okay because people can read multiple books. But Will Self is very upset about the fact that there's a certain genre of fiction, literary fiction, which he feels is in decline, and he thinks it's because people don't want to read difficult things, and that gets into his next point. It goes further. The hallmark of contemporary culture is an active resistance to difficulty in all its aesthetic manifestations, accompanied by a sense of grievance that conflates it with political elitism. Indeed, it's arguable that tilting at this papery windmill of artistic superiority actively prevents a great many people from confronting the very real economic inequality and political disenfranchisement that they're subject to. Exactly as being compelled to chant the mantra choice drowns out the harsh background music telling them that they have none. So interpretation here, I think, is by rejecting anything that is difficult and conflating it with elitism, we are prevented from confronting economic inequality and our declining political power. So here's the thing. 1. Life is hard. People have a limited amount of time in their day, and they don't want to spend it perhaps reading Ulysses, and that's really okay. Generally, the march of human history, what we are all working towards all of the time, is to make ours and other people's lives easier. That is what the entire history of technology and invention is about, for example, which is something that makes us uniquely human. Will Self strikes me as the kind of guy who, upon the invention of the washing machine, would have lamented the fact that his wife no longer has to beat their clothes against a rock in the stream because that built character.
I had trouble expressing it here, but the point I'm trying to make is that when your life is generally difficult day to day just to survive, taking on additional challenges that you don't have to isn't going to be at the top of most people's to-do list because they only have so much time and energy they can devote to things. I don't think this is something we just have to accept of the world, but I think that he is observing symptoms of this phenomenon and concentrating too much on that rather than the underlying cause.
In the early 1980s, and I would argue throughout the second half of the last century, the literary novel was perceived to be the prince of art forms, the cultural capstone and apogee of the creative endeavor. I don't know, Will, maybe because in the 1980s, in the latter half of the last century, if you had a high school diploma, you could get a decent job and buy a house and support your family and not have to work until you're 70. That's not really a reality anymore, and so maybe that's why people don't want to spend all their free time reading Ulysses. Now, I understand this is a sweeping generalization that does not apply to everyone and did not apply to everyone then, specifically racial minorities, women, and poor people, but it stands that the middle class is eroding and we don't have the same kind of prospects economically as our parents did. And it's definitely the case that major costs of living like housing and healthcare in the US and education everywhere are far more expensive than they were in the 1980s or the 1950s or any time in between. And I understand that to some degree I do think he's criticizing this. The thing is, he's getting it backwards, okay? He's saying people don't read litfic anymore because, I don't know, we're all brain dead from Love Island, which might be the case, but also if you have an incredibly stressful life and you're worried about being able to make rent all the damn time and whether or not you will be able to retire before you're 90, are you going to spend a lot of time in your free time, if you have any, challenging yourself, or are you going to try to turn your brain off? The problem is not personal choice, which I think is what he is laying this at. The reason people might not read litfic anymore is not because they don't want to or because they can't. It's probably because they don't have the time. And if you want people to read your litfic, then maybe you could concentrate on bringing about a world in which people have more free time to both read and write the kind of things that you like to see. He's not making that criticism. He's not making the criticism that our capitalist hellhole has driven us all to have no free time and to basically spend any free time we do have trying to dampen the overwhelming anxiety that we all feel all the damn time at modern life. No, he's giving you another thing to feel bad about. Now, I think what he is saying about anti-intellectualism being used specifically by the political right to direct people's attention away from the economic inequality that's been slowly worsening over the last 50 to 70 years, I think that he has a point that, like, that is what's happening, but I don't think he's communicating it very well. And I do think that that is a valid problem that we need to address. We're all so exhausted that we can't really take time to consume something that takes a lot of our brain power. So what is it that we can do so that people do have this time so they can become politically engaged and understand the economic inequality and fight back against these sorts of things? And the problem is that there's a bit of a chicken and egg situation going on here, but one of the things one could do is maybe not write essays that make other people feel stupid for reading things that they like. So this brings us into Will Self's writing style. As has hopefully been demonstrated by the quotes I have read so far, Will Self has a very convoluted way of writing. I don't think I have as many examples in here, but he uses a lot of not necessarily big but obscure words that mean things that more common words are often used for. And I spent a lot of time when reading this book, and because I read it in physical form, I had my phone next to me looking up words a few times a page. And here's the thing that bothers me, is that he is writing about how no one wants to do anything difficult anymore, no one is politically engaged or understands that their rights are being eroded and stuff like that because we're all stuck in our frivolous genre fiction and on social media. But he says it in the most pretentious way that he possibly can, that makes anyone who's reading it think that he has a disdain for everyone who he's talking about and thinks that they're stupid. And in doing this, he wonders why there is a strain of anti-intellectualism in the US and the UK. I don't know, Will. Maybe it's because you're making people feel stupid on purpose. You could say these things in a way that didn't make them feel stupid and didn't blame them for the problem, but instead, you chose to do it in the most difficult way possible. And this is where we get into what I think Will Self's actual intent was when he was writing these essays. Will Self may argue that he is giving me the opportunity to improve myself and improve my reading comprehension, but really this book just made me feel the way I did in high school when I was forced to read Absalom and I threw it across the room because I couldn't understand what the fuck Faulkner was saying. And that is horrible. It's the kind of book that turns people off reading, and that just sucks. Now, Will Self can, of course, write however the hell he wants. It's a free country. He's allowed to do that. And it makes me think that if you are actually concerned about the decline of the literary fiction novel, rather than publishing pretentious essays where you talk down to people who read genre fiction, you could recognize that there are bigger forces at work that are driving people towards easier things to read and making them less likely to challenge themselves with literary fiction. But also, to some degree, I feel like he should be encouraging people to read whatever they can, because it's reading things like fantasy or romance or action books or whatever that makes people comfortable with reading and will perhaps get them into potentially reading literary fiction in the future. And encouraging people to read anything will eventually get them to the place where they're comfortable trying to read everything. The thing I think that Will Self is really complaining about, though, is capitalism. It's the overproduction of books. It's the quantity over quality and producing as much as we can in order to try to make as much money as possible. And believe me, I've definitely seen that recently. I have seen a lot of dumb books that are either under-edited or not edited at all, just kind of released into the world, and they're bad. And I can understand why when you're seeing this sea of really bad books, whether they're just bad at the core or underdeveloped and they could be better, it can be hard because you're just like, why are we wasting resources on these shitty books? And that's definitely a problem with the publishing industry, but it's not because people aren't reading lit fic, it's because of capitalism. Books, like any other form of media, have had the sort of barrier to entry way lowered by the internet and the fact that people can now self-publish either for free or relatively cheaply, especially if they don't hire editors or anything like that. So this lowering or eliminating of the barriers to entry and the reduction of the ability of publishers to gatekeep having a voice, has this led to a lot of really poorly edited or unedited crap being published like through Amazon? Sure. Do I want to go back to a world in which only a few people who went to the same schools and have the same exact background and all think the same way get to decide what we all read? No, I don't want that world.
I'm not sure if there's a good solution to making publishing more balanced between the extremes of publishers cranking out as much as they possibly can and having a small elite in charge of deciding who gets a voice. I think that to some degree, the accessibility of self-publishing has helped put pressure on traditional publishers to feature more diverse voices, as well as proven that those books can sell. However, I've definitely noticed that there's been a quality issue with some publishers where they're putting out a lot of stuff and it's clearly not been given the attention it needs. And I'm honestly honestly not sure if that's new or if I just notice it more now that I'm reading a much higher volume of books than I used to. And I also don't know if this is something inherent to just the business model of being a publisher and the pressures from platforms like Amazon, or if it's just a function of them trying to cut costs and boost their balance sheets. So this is all to say that I'm not advocating that we keep going down this road of just having a lot of crappy books, but I'd rather that than the other extreme. However, it would be nice to find some way to balance it out so that we just get fewer but better books. And I honestly don't know what the solution is there.
So ultimately, I think that capitalism and the just flood of books and media and social media and everything on the internet has definitely made it feel like there's a lot more crap out there now. And there is. But that doesn't mean that literary fiction is dying or dead or will go away. It just means it has to do more maybe to gain attention in this economy. But really the way to do that is not to go and blame individuals for not liking whatever kind of art you like. It's to A, make that kind of art more engaging, and B, fight for a world in which people have the time to consume that art. Okay, so that was hopefully a relatively coherent rant about all the problems I had with Will Self. Like I said, I do think he has some good points, but I just hate his delivery. Yeah, I didn't, it wasn't a good time. Did not like his essays. So anyway, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please like, and if you'd like to see more from me, please subscribe. If you have any thoughts on anything I said or this topic in general, please feel free to leave that down in the comments. I'd love to have a discussion about this and understand what other people's views are. But yeah, I hope you're having a great day wherever you are, and I hope to see you in my next video. Thanks very much. Bye.